Hello again. I'm now gonna be talking about Egypt in DuckMod. And as you may know, Egypt was or is one of the most problematic factions in patch 7. That's mainly due to the fact that Egypt is so versatile and it has some really powerful units. So, balancing Egypt, it was a bit tricky, but I think I've more or less pulled it off. So, let's look at the Egyptian general choices. So, as you can see, the almost all of the units are actually more expensive, except the Carian Axeman and the Royal Taurus Swordsman. So I've raised the card for my cavalry, the Royal Peltists, the Hellenic Royal Guard, and a hefty price increase for the African War Elephants. So looking at the melee infantry choices, they still have the well, I think the Egyptian infantry is pretty cost effective. Especially if you put them in a shield wall, as that will, I think, give them something over 50 defense, so they'll hold for a while. The Carian Axemen, I've increased their charge bonus, and they have a slight increase in melee attack as well. So they're a decent flanking unit. I haven't done much to the Galatian Swordsmen, as they're a very good unit as it is. One of the most cost-efficient units in the main game. I think I've slightly increased their charge. Yeah, and that's about it. So they're comparatively weaker than they used to be, but they're still a very, very good unit. And Taurus Swordsmen, they've got quite a hefty increase in stats. I think I've increased their melee attack by 6, and I've also increased their charge. Let's see. Actually, their charge is reduced, but their melee attack is raised, and their melee defense has been reduced as well a bit. So they're a bit more offensive units than they used to be, but they're a good option if you want an aggressive sword unit that has some durability as well. And now let's look at the elite melee infantry units that Egypt has. So the cheapest option with an aura is the Royal Taurus Swordsman, and I mean, if you compare them to the the Taurus Swordsman, they're not that much more powerful. Better charge, better weapon damage, better defense, and better base morale. But they're a handy unit if you want a reliable infantry unit with an aura that doesn't cost too much. But they won't really set the world on fire in terms of performance. I think you could sort of think of them as slightly weaker barbarian infantry available for Egypt. You could perhaps compare them to the Swordmasters. And then we have the Royal Peltists. They've had reductions in melee attack. Yeah, and a slight reduction in melee defense. But beyond that, they're quite the same, except a slight price increase as well. They're still a very good unit, but they'll struggle against some of the better barbarian infantry. So, good unit, but a bit risky. And then we have the Galatian Royal Guard, which are still powerhouses. They're probably the strongest barbarian infantry unit, but they are also the most expensive one. I've slightly reduced their melee attack. I think it's by 4. Oh, yeah, by 5 actually. So they got 5 less melee attack, but they have +2 charge instead. They also have a slight reduction in melee defense, I think by -1, yeah, and a hefty increase in price. So they're more or less comparable with the Oathsworn, but you'll have to pay 30 costs more. So I think it's a good trade-off. And the weakness of Egypt lies in the spear infantry. So you don't really have any heavy spears, and the levy spears, well, they're cheap, and you'll get a cheap spear unit for that. So if you want some real cavalry killing units, you'll have to rely on the Nubian spearmen and the Tureo spearmen. And they're a bit different units. The Nubians are they're cheaper and they have better health, but they have less armor and charge. But beyond that, they're pretty similar. And the big changes come to the Egyptian pikemen. So, looking at them, they have 15 less armor, and that's due to a reduction in shield values for pikemen. And they also have, I think, almost -10 less melee defense. And this is because I've actually made the pike phalanx stronger than what was in Path 7 by reducing unit spacing. So now you have a pretty dense wall of pikes up at the front. And as we move on to the weaker pike units, you'll see that the armor drops quite considerably. So a unit of Egyptian pikemen, you'll get pretty much torn to shreds by ranged fire. But due to the way the pike phalanx now works, they're actually be quite deadly from the front. So you'll have to shoot or flank them to avoid the wall of death up front. I've also made some changes to the pike phalanx, which I actually forgotten to mention here. They're slightly slower at turning by 20%, and they have 40% slower acceleration, which means that it's harder to reposition pikes that are already engaged, because in the main game it's it's quite easy to just draw a new pike line a bit further back to get the pikes back down. But now you can't really do that, so you will have to be more careful as to where you place your pikes. And for the Egyptian ranged units, I've decreased the price of Egyptian slingers, the Egyptian archers, and the Nubian bowmen, while the javelins stay the same, and I've slightly reduced the price of mercenary Rhodian slingers. So overall, Egypt has a good selection of ranged units, and especially the elite ranged units are very handy. Then we come to the Ptolemaic cavalry. They're fairly similar to what they used to be, but they're just more expensive, so you'll have to pay, I think, 70 more for them. But they'll hold their own against most Lancer units in the game. And then we have the Camel Spearmen. I've increased the defense, or the morale of the camels, so they'll be less likely to rout, and I've also increased their melee attack by a bit. So they're actually useful in melee now, in addition to their scare bonus, which is a bit weaker than it used to be. And the Egyptian cavalry choices are pretty similar. Probably should actually make some changes between the Egyptian cavalry and the light cavalry to make them more useful and more distinct from each other. And then they have the citizen cavalry, which they're fairly, I mean, they're an okay cavalry unit, but nothing that will set the world on fire. They're a bit closer to other cavalry units in terms of stats now than they used to be. Then we have the skirmisher cavalry options, and the big thing is that both skirmisher cavalry and turn tank cavalry now have party and shot, so they'll be more effective against anything that chases them. I've increased the cost of suicided chariots, so they're still very powerful in some situations, and in some situations they're not. I've decreased their mass and I've increased the mass of nearly all infantry, so they'll have a harder time just powering through infantry blobs. And I've done the same thing to a lesser degree with the elephants, and I've also increased the cost of the elephants by quite a bit. So elephants are risky but very powerful, potentially. So elephants are a gamble. But that's about it. Yeah, so with Egypt you have a very versatile army, but you'll have to pay a lot for your elite units, and Egypt lacks some really cost-effective mid-range units beyond the pikes, so you'll have to combine the units of different types quite effectively. Blah. And sorry about that little blah blah blah. But yeah, they're a good faction, and I don't think they're nearly as overpowered as they used to be. But they're still unpredictable, and they still have some really good units. So it's just a matter of finding the right combinations and managing to throw your opponent off by your arm selection. Yeah, thank you.